Good evening and welcome to our New Year version of our webinar Hangouts on Air. And this week, or this month rather, we're looking at pink pork, which is all the rage with all the bright young chefs around the country that we've been following on Facebook. I'll first introduce you to Patrick Mackey. Would you like to say a little bit about what you do, Patrick?
Hi Steve, I'm an environmental health officer working in the west of Scotland, and my interest in food safety is not as a current practitioner but as an EHP, and certainly risky foods is something I'm very interested in, and I think there's an awful lot of misinformation out there, and webcasts like this are the ideal way of addressing some of those misconceptions and getting some good solid science out to people in the industry.
Well, let's hope I got my presentation right and my facts delivered. It's been a bit of a rush to sort it after Christmas, but never mind. We better wish everyone a Happy New Year. And David, if you can introduce yourself as well.
Thanks very much, Steve. Happy New Year to you and anybody who's watching. I'm a freelance training consultant specialising in food safety and health and safety. I support trainers who want to be more creative in their delivery. And I'm very keen never to eat food that could possibly harm me at all, but I recognise that the food industry wants to keep experimenting, and we've got to find a happy medium, or to quote the Moody Blues, a question of balance.
Yeah, I think you're right there. Well, tonight we didn't manage to get the sound right, so I'm going to put this presentation up and I'm going to try and read from my notes at the same time. Hope it works. Can you hear me okay at that end?
Yeah, fine.
Okay, right. So, in the last few years, there's been an increase in the number of people preparing and demanding so-called pink pork. Years ago, very few people would have risked eating undercooked pork. This is mainly because of trichinosis or bacterial infections, but we now also have to consider viral infections such as hepatitis E. Hang on, this is not... Wait a minute, where are we? There we go. Sorry, I didn't put the flyer on even. I will look at all three of these areas in turn and the advice that is given by enforcement agencies, so you can make your own mind up whether it's a safe practice or not. And I'm having to flip between these two to change the slides. This is a Food Standards Agency's approach in Northern Ireland. So this is the advice they're giving on their website. And in Scotland, they've got similar advice, but the only stuff I can really find on there is this one reference, which is more of a domestic audience. There may be other stuff on there, but I simply couldn't find it. I struggle to find any advice for consumers or professionals or practitioners on the latest Food Law Code of Practice that was issued in October 2015. I did expect to find some reference for enforcement agencies on there, but the only reference to pork was for Asian restaurants and how inspectors need to deal with them. Food Standards Agency England, the only specific advice was buried into an article on the presence of hepatitis E from November 2014. Which I'll cover in a little bit more depth in a minute. But that was the actual reference that was there. They were advising people. The only really useful information for England and Wales was from the FSA website, was the advisory report that came out in January last year from the National Food Hygiene Focus Group. And as you probably know, since then, the FSA seems to have lost their way, offering sometimes conflicting advice on things like raw beef burgers. NHS Choices also recommend thorough cooking of pork and go on to talk about cross-contamination. They even recommend thorough cooking if you use frozen meat, even though this will kill off any eggs or cysts in the meat if done for long enough. I think the recommendation is frozen for a minimum of 48 hours. In the States, the United States Department of Agriculture came out with new guidelines in 2011, and they lowered their temperature by about 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and the temperature now they're recommending is just under 63 degrees Celsius, which is about 145 degrees Fahrenheit. Obviously, the pork will be pink when it comes out of that. They've actually come up last year with guidance for people in the States, and they had this checklist which was updated January last year, and you can see they're advocating a core temperature of only just below 63 for pork, which would leave it pink, but there is a resting time that they're recommending for 3 minutes as well. It's worth noting that a lot of American pork is actually not free range, it's sort of factory farmed, and they've got quite a lot better control of the feedstuffs from what I can gather. But then we'll look at this thing, it's called trichinella or trichinosis, and basically it is a parasitic worm. I learned all about trichinosis when I was a trainee chef in the early 70s, and it was the one thing that was really hammered home to us, that we should never have undercooked pork because we would all get sick with these parasites. It's been suggested that as many as 11 million people worldwide could potentially be affected by trichinosis, and an estimated 10,000 cases occur every year. However, the incidence of the disease in most European and North American countries has been decreasing for many years. It's now much rarer, but also beware of animals that have been foraging and not fed on treated animal feed, as there will be much more of a risk. This is an infographic, and it shows if pigs are left outside to forage, there is an increased risk of them becoming infected with trichinosis. The cyst will get into their muscle tissue, which, if left undercooked, will infect a human. Over the last few years, there has been an increase in provision and also demand for free-range pigs. So if you are sourcing this for your personal or professional use, then please bear in mind the increased risk of trichinosis and make sure you cook anything thoroughly to kill off any cysts. This was an extract from the advisory group, and as they say on the advice, and this was turned into the advice on pink pork from the 13th of November by the Food Standards Agency. And as they say on the advice, 71 degrees for 20 minutes, but they don't have much idea at the moment on the levels of hepatitis C in pork at the moment. So they've said that they are not changing their current advice. Based on that, they are going to go for some more research, and they're not going to change it until that research has been done. I haven't actually been able to come across anything that's been published on that research, but presumably that's still ongoing. The last of the three problems that I've been aware of for pork being undercooked is bacterial contamination. And bacteria that are commonly associated with pork food poisoning include Campylobacter, E. coli, although E. coli 157, as far as I'm aware, hasn't been found in pigs. So that's one of the serotypes that are quite dangerous, but it's not been found on pigs. But you could get it from cross-contamination. Salmonella, Staph aureus, Listeria monocytogenes, and Yersinia enterocolytica, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it's the one that we used to have it on the CIH syllabus and the Highfield, I believe the Highfield syllabus, but it seems to have disappeared over the years. Yersinia enterocolytica can be destroyed by thorough cooking, so it's important to ensure that pork is well cooked. And the advice here is ignore recipes which call for pork to be lightly cooked or undercooked. So, if you only select factory-reared pig meat and not free range, then there appears to be little chance that you're going to get trichinosis. Yes, there's a possibility, but it's not not that likely compared to what it was years ago. Undercooking will probably not kill hepatitis E, and it looks like this may be one of the next emerging pathogens. So you need to keep an eye on it. If we get any more on hepatitis E, we'll probably run a webinar on it, and I'm sure that my colleagues who have their own newsletters and websites will put that information and share that as well. And also there is a risk with bacterial food poisoning, especially from Yersinia enterocolitica. I will get that word right eventually. So thanks for watching this short presentation. So now we'll get back to the panel, and if you've got any questions, if you are watching, then that's great. If not, we'll just have a bit of a discussion. I've actually got some information as well on Yersinia, in case anyone's got any questions on it. I've got some of the characteristics here printed out. Can't keep them all in my head, I'm afraid. It's too complicated. Okay, so back to you folks.
Well, I was just trying to do some live internet research there, because you obviously presented a range of different sources, and you know, it's hard enough for the food professionals to know what's the current thinking and advice, but for the public it must be almost impossible. Yeah. There's an advisory committee for the microbiological safety of food report on viruses in the food chain.
Yeah.
But it's 190 odd pages, and I haven't found the page that says it's exactly what we need to find. I've got it on the other computer here, and I'm just trying to find it out. But the core temperatures here are somewhat higher than the 63 that the Americans are quoting.
Well, that's it. But the only thing I can take from that is that the Americans, the food chain is important. I mean, what I was reading earlier today was in places like Romania, Bulgaria, Eastern Europe, there is a much higher incidence of trichinosis. But in Europe, Western Europe, and in the UK and in the US, generally speaking, factory-reared pigs, there's a much less risk of having it. It's still there, but much less than it was even a few years ago. And that's just because of our animal husbandry. It's a little bit like, if we look 25 years ago, what the chicken industry was like for salmonella, and it's nowhere near like it was then. It's Campylobacter that's the problem. But I do suspect that hepatitis E will be the thing of the future.
I think so. I found a paragraph here which is that the ACMSF report said that 70 degrees for 2 minutes in pork products was not enough to destroy hepatitis E. But it doesn't say what temperature would destroy it.
No, I had this sort of conversation in one of the chefs groups, and one of the reasons for me bringing this subject to this webinar is that the amount of people who are saying, oh, well, yes, but there's not a problem with this, and there's not a problem with that. Fine. I've just presented the facts that I've got off these various websites and enforcement agencies so people can make their own idea. But an environmental health colleague of mine who I didn't speak to her, I had a conversation online on one of the Facebook groups, and I said, well, what would you do if you saw someone cooking pork out to 63 in the UK? Or in England and Wales? She's a Welsh-based environmental health. She says I'd probably take them to court, prosecute them. You know, I'm not sure what the regs exactly say specifically for pork, but she said she would take action. What's your thought?
Legislation simply requires, Steve, that people provide safe food. I wonder whether the American guidelines are aimed at controlling bacterial contamination and are not necessarily based, including the risk from hepatitis E virus.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I've no idea what the incidence of Hep E on pork is in the States. It may be similar, it may be totally different.
Well, I do have data for the prevalence of Hep E virus in UK pigs at the time of slaughter. There was a pig abattoir survey carried out in 2013, and that's available on the internet. And the data found that 93% of the pigs examined, and there were 600 odd pigs examined, had Hep E virus antibodies in the plasma. However, when you look at the actual levels of infection, approximately 1% of the animals were considered to have sufficient virus to be able to cause infection. And the Department of Health guidance remains cooking pork to a core internal temperature of 71 for 20 minutes. In Ireland, the Food Safety Agency of Ireland give quite good advice here for a couple of reasons. Talks about a core temperature of 85, which will be broadly equivalent to the same sort of cook. And the very important thing here, it's not recommended to rely on visual cues alone to determine thorough cooking, and a thermometer should always be used instead. So I think there's some useful information there. But
yeah, I mean, the biggest problem with these sort of things is what advice to give to the people who are actually the sharp end, the consumers, and of course the people who are cooking this stuff. I do feel that chefs believe that there are people who are trying to stop creative catering, novel cuisine, etc., etc. And I think sometimes they're under great pressure to get the right interpretation of what the requirements are. And it's not helped when the Food Standards Agency gives out conflicting advice, as they did on the rare burgers. And, you know, I mean, the chefs are there to try and give the customer what the customer is demanding. And quite often, customers do demand pink pork. I mean, I've got a bit of a prejudice against it because of my training back in the early 70s. And, you know, I've always not wanted to get trichinosis, even though the risk is minimal. I still view it as a little bit like, you know, sort of a lower risk version of Russian roulette. What's your thoughts on the roundworm side of things, David?
Well, I think this pressure about the customer wants undercooked meat. I'm just wondering whether the customer thinks it's somehow better, and therefore it's shall we say, more sophisticated or different. But in fact, I'll resolutely stand by the fact for 40 years that you cook food properly, and that anybody who doesn't want to cook food properly is really causing interminable problems for the food industry by demanding something that intuitively we all know is not something you would choose as a way of sustaining yourself. So whether the risk is small, you know, the risk is small for many things, but it's, in a simple way, it's completely avoidable if we don't go down the road of trying to be clever and too clever with food. That's my view. Then again, I don't eat oysters. I mean, you know, I don't know whether that's a controversial statement or not, but there's just some things that I won't entertain eating because I can't be bothered with thinking about the risk.
I remember as a young man, I went to the local pub and I bought a pint of Guinness on Christmas night, and there was no one in the pub, and a bottle or a jar of cockles, and this was sort of early 70s. And by the time I got home, I was violently ill, and it wasn't the Guinness. And I've never touched, well, apart from one cooking exam I had to do as a trainee chef, I've never touched shellfish. I had to do, I think it was moules marinières for one of my practical exams, and we were always taught that if you cook food, you've got to taste it.
I mean, I know what Patrick's going to say now, or if he's not, he should do. We recently had an evening out in Glasgow, and of all the places he took several of us to, I won't say who else was there, we went to a blooming oyster bar, and none of us had oysters.
I think it's the nature of the risk. With oysters, the key risk here, apart from algal toxins, which can be very nasty, but are monitored, the key risk is norovirus.
Yeah.
Which for somebody who's reasonably healthy, the risk of actually contracting it from oysters is relatively low, and it's self-limiting, although nasty while you've got it, infection. With other organisms like hepatitis E or trichinella or food pathogens like salmonella, the consequences are much, much greater, and therefore the risk is different. And we have to think about that. when I was training, we talked about hepatitis A, hepatitis B, and nobody knew, and nobody had really distinguished the other hepatitis viruses. David's nodding there.
Yeah.
Now, we do know much more. We have much better information about the nature of these various different viruses. And we do know that they are nasty. Hepatitis is a very unpleasant disease. And for some people, like pregnant women or immunocompromised people, it can be very serious indeed and even fatal. So when we are looking at a risk where we know that 1%, to pick one figure, of the UK pig population is infected at levels which can cause disease, and people can potentially die from it, is that a risk that businesses really should be taking for the sake of fashion?
Yeah, I mean that's my point. Let's suppose we create an artificial fashion for undercooked chicken. Now, I just wonder where the debate would be when we know that approximately between 15 and 70% of chickens carry Campylobacter either at low or high levels, which is a serious low infective dose infection that can cause Guillain-Barré disease, etc., Guillain-Barré syndrome. Would we entertain the same debate, or would we just say you're not doing it?
I think one of the things there, as you know, I get on these chefs' Facebook groups, and I've also got quite a lot of chefs on LinkedIn, on social media. And one of the reasons for this is partly, okay, it's just part of my marketing plan, but also there's a lot of misinformation out there. And on most of the groups that I've joined, I've sort of become one of the go-to people for food safety, which is why I passed around, I think one of the groups I'm in is called Chef Book, and I'm one of the administrators for the group, and it's got over 50,000 members worldwide. But the problem is that they pass all this information around. And you mentioned raw chicken there, David. Trust me, I've seen people advocating that.
No.
No, seriously, I've got chefs saying it's okay to do it, provided you scald the outside of the meat, a solid breast, with boiling water for 2 or 3 seconds. I kid you not. You ought to join some of these groups, and then the trouble is that they tend to believe each other, and it's one of my worries is that things like sous vide, they don't listen to any professional advice or go to the free online training for vacuum packing or anything like that. They take each other's word as gospel among chefs, and these myths, as I say, when I first started talking about pink pork, the number of people said, no, it's okay, it's not a problem these days. But clearly there still is a problem. It might have changed, and there's less risk of trichinosis, for example. That's clear in factory farmed pigs, not in free-range pigs, but certainly in factory farmed. But the risk of hepatitis C, which worked there a few years ago, now increased. And I'm not really being able to come up with anything much in the way of incidences of other bacterial infections. Yersinia is the one that is mostly associated with pork, but again, it was taken off the syllabus for the level 4, the advanced food safety. Now, was that because it wasn't as common? Who knows?
But what do you think about this? See, when the Food Standards Agency decided to respond to consumer pressure for the rare burger issue, what they did, along with many other experts who are much more knowledgeable than me, is they sat down and said, if we look at all the possible evidence, it is possible to say that you could possibly do it safely if a load of other things were controlled. So by being honest, they've caused what we will call confusion. But what they've said is, well, that's the actual completely scientific situation, that it is possible to do it, except what we know is those messages are not simple or straightforward enough. But what the Food Standards Agency is saying is, we say you should cook everything properly. If you choose not to, as a food business, you have to carry the responsibility.
Yeah. I mean, that says so in the paper I was looking at from January last year from the advisory group. They were saying, yes, if someone asks for it and they serve, that's fine. But if they get made ill from it, then they will be liable to be prosecuted.
Yeah.
I think that's where it lies. But bowing to public pressure, I mean, the one thing that I had a problem or an issue with was they were saying, yes, you can do it safely, but they weren't really giving an awful lot of information on what that safely meant in practical terms. For example, sear and shave, or what that meant in preventing further cross-contamination.
Yeah.
The advice simply wasn't sound enough, in my humble opinion.
And I think this is the thing, Steve. Once you start to move away from traditional sound cooking practices, which are designed to produce safe food, then you have to start understanding the ecology of the organism you're looking at. Viruses behave differently in the body from bacteria. Yeah. Mostly bacteria are in the gut, or they're on the skin of the animal. Viruses are distributed throughout the body because they're carried in the bloodstream. Also, you cannot, we know that bacteria move around the flesh of poultry in a different way from the flesh of beasts. So you can't say, well, I can use this technique on beef, and therefore it is safe on chicken, because it isn't. We know that bacteria penetrate the flesh of poultry far more easily and readily, and are found throughout the carcass. And that's also an attribute of the slaughtering process. So because food safety management systems based on HACCP principles mean you have to understand the hazard, that means that anyone who wants to do something novel can do so, provided they've done the research, understand the data, and understand the controls, and have validated controls, and can show it can happen. Now, the point here when we're talking about hepatitis C in pork is it's quite clear that the virus is distributed throughout the flesh of the animal, throughout the cut. It's not simply on the surface. And the only way of destroying it is a fairly good, thorough cook.
Yeah, yeah.
And there is no alternative to that. And the situation is even worse when you start considering pig's liver pate and so on, where you have lightly cooked livers. Research from France shows that the vast majority of lightly cooked pig liver pate products includes hepatitis C virus, so it is really quite a risky product. So there's a whole other world of pain there for people who are trying to produce safe food, and they have my commiserations.
Well, it makes me wonder whether the insurance industry might pick up the cudgel in the same way that it has done in health and safety very recently, by saying to various companies if they don't have decent health and safety management systems, they're not going to insure them. Now, I've not heard of that issue transferring into the food industry yet, but it might be one to come, because I take it that most food businesses, when they're seeking out liability insurance, look for the insurance to cover them for food poisoning outbreaks as well as accidents. But it's not one I've seen, the phenomenon I've yet seen. I don't know if either of you have seen. I'm
not so sure that some of the smaller businesses will do that. Obviously they'll have some form of public liability, for slips and falls and that sort of thing. But I've never seen any reference to any form of cover for food poisoning outbreaks, for example. I think that's just sort of, well, if you get it, then you're going to be facing prosecution in all liability anyway. Just before we close, I just wanted to ask you, Patrick, on or both of you in actual fact, I've not been able to find any reference. We know that poultry, including duck, etc., you should cook thoroughly, although there is a large percentage of people go for pink duck as well, and we've covered that before. And we know that you can have, at the moment, there's no evidence to say you can't have rare steak as long as it's from a solid cut. But what I'm not clear, and I'm not seeing any research or evidence for, I know the viruses can go through the flesh of the pork because it's bloodstream contaminated. But what about bacteria from the gut, for example, on pigs? Will it penetrate the flesh? Or is it simply a case of you cook the outside and you got rid of the bacterial contamination, even if you haven't got the hepatitis infection?
My understanding is if you have a healthy animal So it doesn't have a bacteremia or a septicemia or anything like that, which should be dealt with at ante-mortem and the animal taken out of the food chain. That the contamination of the flesh with gut bacteria will arise from contamination during the slaughtering and dressing process.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of research that has been done in terms of improving the hygiene of slaughter for pigs. In fact, there are papers in the same conference where that paper on the pig abattoir survey. But so I think in terms of the bacterial hazard, it's very, very similar. But we do have this additional hazard with pork and with venison, by the way.
Yeah.
Hepatitis C virus is also prevalent in venison. So we have two risky meats and sets of offal, don't forget the offal, with hepatitis E, where you have to apply a more substantial cook to destroy the virus than you would simply to kill bacteria.
And not forgetting the top end of the chain, where you've got things like wild boar on the menu as well, and other similar sort of cuts of meat. Just before we finish, I'll just show you if I can find the thing. I just found this online. It's a free download. Start the screen share up, and I found this very small video. Can you see it there?
Yep.
And that's actually showing you what trichinosis looks like in the flesh, as it were. And I thought that might just make people think. I know we've said that it's not as risky if you're using factory farm pig from a reputable supplier, but I think that two things with it, from, if I can remember correctly, I think that if people are going to be ill with this, they would be ill within about 8 hours. But the other thing is that usually after a certain period of time, the people can actually just get rid of the organism anyway, just be excreted, apparently. So I don't know how it's supposed to invade the muscle tissue of the human host or not.
The problem is that the animals will actually migrate into the muscle tissue.
And once they're there, you've got the cysts then, yeah.
And form cysts, which become very painful. And there's no way of treating them.
Mm.
Why I like these hangouts, Steve, I'll tell you now, while we're live and being recorded, because it makes me realise I've got to go and do some more reading. So I've got I know it's funny, but that's why these hangouts are so good. It's because I've got the ACMSF report on viruses in front of me, and you know, last year I was saying, oh, somebody else can read that. It's only 136 pages, but I'm more inclined to go and read it now because I know what I'm looking for. So
yeah.
Thank you both for inspiring me to go and do a bit more homework on the thing that was staring me in the face, and that's why I like doing these events.
I mean, as you probably gather, I'm a bit of a magnet or whatever. I love doing research. I'm not a great reader of paper-based documents at all, but I do like going online and trying to find things out. And I talk to other professionals like yourself to try and keep my knowledge up to speed. And I think these are great because whether or not other people get anything out of them or not, I certainly manage my CPD very well from these sorts of presentations. So I'd like to thank all of the presenters who've been doing this over the last couple of years, for their input, because I think it's great. It's a great way of learning of each other.
Yeah, and I think if you have a CPD requirement on you as a membership of a professional body, certainly for the CIH, I can speak for them. I think if I were to sit down now and reflect for half an hour on what I was going to read next and what I'd not known, then I would be recording an hour's CPD.
Yeah.
And I think it's as simple as that. And the beauty about it is it's no travel time and no cost to me. And I think that's what makes these kind of things just right.
Incidentally, for anyone watching this, that Google have actually changed their social media. They've now split up Hangouts. They've done it on the iPhones and the Androids already, but they split Hangouts as a separate web cast from the Google Plus account. Now, I'm not sure whether or not they're doing that because Google Hangouts has really taken off worldwide, whereas Google Plus, by comparison, is a lot less accessed than, say, Facebook, for example.
Yeah.
But the one thing that I would ask or suggest to people they do is look. A lot of professionals won't use Facebook for work because they don't want them to see the stupid stuff they get up to at home, like, oh, I've just had a glass of Coke, for my tea tonight, or whatever, or I've just been for a walk or whatever. They don't want the personal stuff shown. But seriously, professionals now need to get to grips with Facebook groups.
Yeah.
It's a hell of a way of keeping connected with like-minded professionals, with the customer, for the marketing, for all sorts of reasons. I mean, as you two probably are aware, that I've got my range of groups, which is like Food Safety UK, Allergen UK, Professional Trainers UK, and all the rest of it, or Health and Safety UK. But I've also, as I say, I'm now an administrator of a group of chefs where we have over 50,000 people. So there's a great sort of responsibility there to get stuff right for these people. But also, it's a great place to learn stuff as well. I've actually had some very useful information from a chef yesterday who sent me a lot of information on that site. So I'd like to say probably thank you to Rick. I won't give his name, but thanks to Rick anyway. And hopefully I'm going to either watch this live or watch this later. So anyway, folks, I'm going to hang on here after we've closed the broadcast for a couple of minutes. Now, I haven't a clue what we're doing next month. I need to sit down with people and get some volunteers to do some stuff this year, and maybe think of some titles. This one came sort of quite naturally at the end of the Christmas one, which we did with Hugh Mantle at the beginning of December. So anyway, it's good night from me. Patrick?
Good night, Steve. This has been a fascinating hangout, and as David said, there's lots more to research and find out.
Yes, David.
And good night from me too. Have a pleasant evening, everybody. And I'm just looking at my calendar for the 2nd of February, the next Tuesday.
Yeah.
And I'm not available on that evening, I'm afraid.
Not so really, but I'm sure we normally get someone coming along anyway. And if I have to do the presentation, then so be it. But I'm quite happy to let other people have their 5 minutes of fame and presenting something that's of interest. Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much, folks, for watching, and we'll be back with you next month.